and other people I'm sure will be joining in as we move along here. But thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Joanne Scanlon. I am the Executive Director of the United Solar Energy Supporters. We're a nonprofit organization focused on educating people about solar energy. So I would first like to introduce Jesse. Jesse is he is the co-founder and chief commercial officer at SolaryCycle. And that is a tech-driven recycling company focused on producing sustainable and domestic materials at scale for the solar industry. He spent many years working with the Sierra Club as the chief of staff and national program director, where he led climate and clean energy strategy. So he has lots of experience in circular economy, making sure that nothing is wasted, and experience scaling and managing large teams, which is going to be very important as we ramp up with solar recycling. And just so you know that he walks the walk and talks the talk. The facility that SolaryCycle has is going to be run with reused SolaryCycle panels, I believe. So this is a way where we're reusing, and he leads by example. So we will get started right now. Jesse, if you'd like anything to say, go ahead, and then I'll get started sharing the presentation.
All right, thanks for that nice introduction, Joanne. Nice to meet you all. Appreciate the opportunity. So I'm joining you from Oakland, California, where we launched this company. Our main facility is in Texas, and we're opening a new facility in Arizona. And our vision is to have multiple locations across the country. But I want to let you know I am here in California, but I am actually pretty familiar with what's going on in New York, because there's actually quite a few policies that many of you may be aware of in New York that connect to solar panel recycling. So just wanted to say hello from California. Joanne did a great job introducing me. I am the co-founder at SolaryCycle, chief commercial officer. Our mission is to make solar even more sustainable by creating a low-cost, tech-driven, environmentally sustainable circular economy platform for the world's largest solar companies. And as Joanne mentioned, I haven't always been doing this. Prior to founding SolaryCycle a year or so ago, I had spent 2 decades at the Sierra Club working on climate policy and clean energy, and could have been doing that the rest of my life, but just started seeing a bunch of trends that were concerning to me around clean energy, and the fact that, we were just not, from what I could tell, given the amount of solar and wind and storage that we were going to need, it was not clear to me how we were going to get enough of the raw minerals and materials to power all of that. And it really came home to me one day when a company that I won't name showed up at our offices and started pitching me on supporting their efforts to do deep sea mining for these nodules that could replace all the things that go into batteries and turbines and panels. And while I was very concerned about the impacts of deep sea mining and definitely did not choose to support their initiative, they really did make a compelling case that we did not have enough raw minerals and materials to make this transition from a hydrocarbon-based economy of coal, oil, and gas to one powered by the wind, the sun, and the earth, unless we figured out how to break away from extractive practices of the past in terms of how we make these energy technologies of the future, and instead adopt a more circular economy approach where we figure out how to design for recycling, extend the life as much as possible, reuse the panels, recycle the materials. And so it was that realization, that meeting with this company, that got me really thinking about how can I play a role. I found a co-founder in Suvi Sharma, who is a founder of NextTracker, one of the largest tracking companies that makes the trackers that the big solar panels sit on. And also he's a CEO at Solaria, one of the largest US solar panel manufacturers. And I worked with him at Sierra Club on clean energy stuff. And he agreed this was a huge opportunity. So we both left what we were doing and got this company going, and found a third co-founder, Pablo Diaz, who is one of the world's leading academics and researchers on the issue of solar panel recycling and policy. And so that's who I am. That's where I'm coming from. And what Joanne asked me to do tonight is walk you through kind of the overall dynamics that are going on within the industry of recycling and solar, and then talk a bit about what we're doing to address those dynamics, and then touch on some of the policies that are moving across the country, including in New York, and then we can open it up to questions. So with that, Joanne, if you want to throw up the deck, I can start going through that. All right. So let's go to the next slide. So this is part of the challenge that we're facing, right? If we're going to hit net zero, if we're going to be on target for 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees in line with the Paris Accords, simply in this country, that's already pretty far ahead in terms of installing solar, we're going to need nearly 10 times more solar deployed every year than we installed last year. And this is a study done by the Solar Energy Industry Association, and it looked at what we would need to be on track for 1.5 degrees. You can see in 2022, we were at about 10 gigawatts. And if you look out to 2030, it's nearly 10 times that. So there is a lot of solar that needs to go in, which is great. But if you go to the next slide, Joanne, the impact of that is that it's going to require a lot more raw minerals and materials, which of course will have impacts in terms of water quality and damage to environment. In terms of landscapes, it also has a significant climate impact, and that's one of the reasons we're putting all the solar out in the first place, is to avoid, climate chaos, or at least mitigate as much as possible. And so you certainly don't want to all of a sudden have a massive new amounts of climate emissions from the mining and extraction of the minerals we need for the clean energy economy. And what this chart shows here is it comes from the World Bank, and they looked at this question of what are the minerals that we need to make this transition and which ones have the most impact on the climate. And what you can see is on the left, aluminum, while not a rare earth mineral, actually is one of the most important minerals and materials we're going to need for making this transition. And it has by far the biggest impact on the climate because it's so energy intensive to produce. And you can see that solar PV, the yellow chunk, is the biggest driver of that by far. And what's great news as far as recycling is concerned is that if you use recycled aluminum instead of virgin bauxite and all the mining that goes into it, it uses 95% less energy and therefore has 95% less climate impact. So there's a huge opportunity to shrink that bar on the left quite a bit as far as aluminum goes if we do solar panel recycling. The other one I want to point to just really quickly is graphite. That's the second biggest impact on climate as we make this transition to a world of solar and storage and wind. And that graphite is mostly going into batteries for cars and for grid storage. And while solar panels don't have graphite, it turns out that a lot of new companies here in the United States are figuring out how do you replace graphite with micronized silicon to replace the graphite in the anode. And we're finding that there are quite a few buyers of silicon that's coming out of solar panels that can replace that graphite. We don't quite know how much of that bar can be replaced, but it's actually going to be probably quite significant. So I just put that out there as a way of conceptualizing the potential benefits of recycling solar panels rather than just mining them up, is you can really get at two of the biggest drivers of climate impacts from solar simply by recycling these solar panels. So Joanne, if you want to go to the next slide. NREL, the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, saw this problem emerging, and they studied this a couple of years ago to find out, okay, we know we need a lot more solar. How many of these critical materials, I use that term lightly, let's say important materials, can we get from recycling? And what they found is by 2030, to hit that bar I showed you earlier, to be on track for 1.5 degrees, you get nearly 50% of the silver and 30% of these other materials. And that's pretty significant, particularly if you think about silver. Right now, silver for solar is about somewhere between 15 and 20% of all the silver used in the world is going into solar panels. So if we can recycle that and get it back into the domestic supply chain for the next wave of solar panels, that's a huge, huge benefit for the environment and for jobs and climate and all those things. The other thing I'll say is that this study was done 2 or 3 years ago when they were looking at some pretty basic and rudimentary recycling platforms and technologies. What we're doing is leaps and bounds more effective at extracting value out of the panel. So I think that these numbers are actually should be seen as a floor rather than a ceiling. And I wouldn't be surprised if we can get a lot more. In fact, our chief technology officer, who's a leading researcher in this field, believes that theoretically, you could basically, by mining and refining one panel from today, you could make a whole new panel tomorrow, because you're able to extract so much of the value and because we're getting more efficient in how we're using those materials. So I don't know that it's going to be a 1-for-1 anytime soon, but it certainly will be better than this. So there's a huge opportunity if we can get recycling going. Joanne, if you go to the next slide. And the impact of that, to put it in climate terms, is quite significant, because we think there will be somewhere between 150 and 200 million panels reaching end of life in the United States by the end of this decade. And if we were to recycle and reuse those panels instead of throwing them in a landfill, that's nearly 200 million tons of carbon, which is the equivalent of 24 million homes or 43 million cars taken off the road. So it's definitely a very important tool in our tool belt when we're going after climate. And as people who are really focused on accelerating the deployment of clean energy, we should really be thinking about how do we make it as sustainable as possible. So if you go to the next slide, that's why we launched the company. And these are some shots of our first factory in the heart of the Permian Basin, which is where most of the oil and gas industry in this country is based. We decided to put our first factory there because we wanted to show that you could have a circular economy in Texas. We thought, look, we're a mining and refining company essentially, and what better place to do that than in Texas? And so we launched the factory in November of last year in a commercial pilot phase. It's now, we have 2 lines running fully that are doing about 300,000 panels a year. And by the end of this year, we will have 4 to 5 lines running and have 1 million panels a year. We're also opening a second facility in Mesa, Arizona, and we're looking at a third location in the Southeast so that we can cover the country. And I'll get into it later, but our general mental model here is that it's actually, there's a lot of benefit to scale and centralization. And so, a lot of recycling, e-waste, some of these other things, it makes sense to have a bunch of small nodes all over the country. With this, there's so much that goes into the technology, and particularly when you start trying to create new value-added products out of that glass and out of the aluminum, you want that to be in a centralized place. So we're likely going to have 2 to 3 central facilities by the end of next year, where we hope to be able to process many gigawatts worth of solar panels each year. So if we can go to the next slide. Just quickly, we're getting a fair amount of traction. We're still a startup, right? We started last year, but we raised a pretty solid round of financing at the beginning of this year. We've got some very thoughtful and sophisticated investors, including Closed Loop Partners, which are one of the biggest circular economy venture firms in the country. They're based in New York. Some of you may know them. We got Prologis, one of the largest real estate owners with huge solar on their rooftops, and then Fifth Wall and HG Ventures, who are both great investors. And then you can see we've gotten some of the biggest solar asset owners and companies on board as customers, from AES to Sunrun and a bunch of companies in between. We've got over 30 gigawatts of customers in contract right now, and we're hoping to double that by the end of the year. So we're really, the market seems to like what we're doing and wants to support this because they see the need and the opportunity. So next slide, please. In terms of what we do, I'm just gonna give you a quick overview of how we operate, and then I'll get into some of the policy considerations. So basically, we start off, we meet with customers, and just so we're clear, we don't work with like individual homeowners. We're really a business to business organization that is looking at how do we work with those companies that own millions of panels, gigawatts of panels, right? And that, you'll see later in my presentation, that really is the vast majority of the market. And so we sit down with those companies at the front end and say, okay, what does your portfolio look like? How is it spread out? What kind of farms do you have? Or are you a big residential leasing company like a Sunrun or a Sonova? Are you a major independent power producer like an AES? Are you a manufacturer like Q-Cells? Each of those are different kinds of portfolios. We sit down, we come up with a plan, then we put together a contract that is a multi-year contract to give them recycling solutions and reuse solutions that they can count on. When they have an issue, so whether it's a warranty failure or a storm or the panels just reach end of life, we provide reverse logistics where we will send our trucks out to their site, pick it up, bring it back to our facility. Once it gets to our facility, and we'll bring it to the closest one to wherever they are, we provide rapid testing to see, is the panel still reusable? Does it have life left on it? And if so, the first thing we do is we're surrounding our own facility, as Joanne mentioned, so that we can power our recycling from Second Life panels. But over time, we want to prove that you can do large scale behind the meter Second Life projects. And then we'll start doing that nearby to where we have our recycling facilities, so that you only have to ship the panels once, they stay close to our recycling facility, or maybe even right at our recycling facility. And then when they're truly reaching end of life, we can recycle them and return those minerals and materials back to the supply chain. The next thing over is really the heart of what we're doing, which is the low-cost, eco-friendly recycling, where we're going after and extracting 95% of the value of what's in a panel. I'll go through that in a minute. And then finally, we provide our customers with advanced environmental reporting for their ESG reports, so they can really understand what impact they're having by recycling instead of landfilling. So that's an overview of why customers are choosing us and the solutions we are providing them. If you go to the next slide, Joanne. Once we get the panels, it's important, we don't want to just start recycling panels if they have life left on them. I won't go through the whole process here, but the bottom line is, when we get panels, if they're not, obviously hammered from a hailstorm or a hurricane, we test them. And if and we have a test that's been designed by a leading testing entity, and assuming that it passes that test, then we either reuse them on site, as I said, or find a way to resell them nearby. And right now, actually, something like 30% of the panels we're getting are able to be reused for a second life, which is great. And we think that number may go up over time. So that's first, reuse before you recycle, like everything else. That's true here in solar. But plenty of the panels we're getting are hammered from some kind of major storm or a warranty issue, and they can't be fixed, they can't be reused. And so the next thing we do is start to recycle. And when we look at recycling, our focus is, you're right, sorry, our focus is really, as much as possible, we want to get to zero waste. Now, we're not there yet, and I'll tell you the things we're not able to fully recycle. But for those of you who aren't totally familiar with how a panel's made, the aluminum frame, that is very easy to recycle. Even the most rudimentary recyclers doing solar are getting that solar frame off because it's got a fair amount of value and it's pretty easy to remove. And we're definitely getting 100% of that. The glass is not particularly valuable yet, but people are recycling. It's 100% recyclable. We're recycling it, but I'll get to later our vision for how we can take what is currently kind of downcycled glass and upcycle it and turn it back into new solar sheets for the emerging solar manufacturing capacity that's coming here in the States. But bottom line is we are getting basically all that glass and we are able to recycle it. In the middle, you've got all the precious metals. That's your laminate, where you've got the cells, which are made of silicon and silver and copper. And it turns out it's very tricky to get that cell layer separated from the glass and separated from all those plastics. And that's where our patents and intellectual property and innovation really lie, is in separating that stuff out. But we are currently getting over 90% of those metals extracted and returned back to the supply chain. And we think we can keep getting better and better at that. The one thing that we have not yet figured out is what to do with the plastics, particularly the backsheet. There's two kinds of plastics that go in the solar panel. There's the EVA, which kind of sticks it all together. And that is actually pretty recyclable. But the backsheet is made up of stuff that nobody's figured out how to recycle. And that ends up being somewhere around 5% of the weight of a panel. And so I don't know that we're going to come up with a great solution for that. We got a few people we're talking to that are doing some interesting things, but the big solution for plastics to get to zero waste is to convince manufacturers to stop using the plastics and move to what's called a bifacial panel, where you kind of have glass on the top and glass serves as the backsheet. So that's our current solution to ultimately have a zero waste product in the solar panel. So if you can go to the next slide, I'll just walk you through how we do it. So when the panels get onto our site, we take them off a pallet. We have a bunch of workers out there with hard hats, and they're loading a panel one at a time onto our conveyor belt. And basically we have an automated disassembly line from there that begins by popping off the frame, and then it saws off the junction box. And out of that, you get high quality aluminum alloy, and you also get a bunch of copper and other things that are in the wires in the junction box. The next thing is, once you got the frame removed, you've got the glass and the laminate, and we have a couple different tools that we are perfecting that remove the glass. One removes it with a hot knife and just gets the sheet off perfectly cleanly. Another one grinds the glass off to within a few millimeters of the laminate. But either way, we're getting very high quality, low iron glass that in theory could be worth $100 a ton. And currently we're getting significantly less than that because we're not able to sell it to the solar industry, but we are able to recycle it. And that is about 70 to 75% of the weight of a panel. So it's very important to be able to get that glass out and get it out cleanly. And we're doing that. Once you've gotten the glass and the frame and everything else left, you've really just got this, it's pretty cool. You've just got the laminate left and kind of rolls up like a yoga mat. And that's where all the value is really in the panel. It's like, I don't know, 5% of the weight, and it has over 50% of the value, but it's very hard to get at because it still has the plastics that are holding it all together. And so we have a machine, and this is all proprietary and patented, but we have this a set of machines really that crush it and grind it all down and dry it into the right size particles. And then we've got a metal separations set of tools that basically move all the metals away from the remaining plastics and glass. And that's how we're able to get 95% of the value of those materials that we can then sell back into the domestic supply chain for those materials. They're not all going back into solar yet, but eventually that is the vision. So if we can go to the next slide. As I mentioned, our customers want to, and stakeholders want to know, like, okay, what's the value of this? And our CTO, Pablo, wrote the published papers that created the methodology for evaluating what are the climate impacts and the air and water impacts and all, like, dozens of factors. And we use that to produce environmental impact reports to our customers that they can use as part of their case for why, because you do spend more to recycle rather than landfill at this point. And so being able to show them really concretely and with credibility what the benefits are, that has a lot of value. And it has value to regulators and other stakeholders as well. So we go to the next slide. So if that's what we're doing today, this is a visual representation, not obviously yet real, of where we want to head. And where we want to head is have a gigafactory size project where we can be doing over 3 million panels a year, which is basically a gigawatt of solar a year, where we will surround our site with second life solar panels that will be powering our entire facility. And then on top of simply recycling, like in that front building there, we're not only recycling, we are also creating value-added products with those materials. So we might be micronizing the silicon on site to sell to as a product that can go into anodes for batteries. We are looking at making aluminum frames that can go right back into the solar industry using fully recycled solar panels. And the one I'm most excited about is we are in the process of contracting to build out America's first solar glass factory that can do many gigawatts of glass, mixing in recycled cullet from our process in with virgin materials. But because it's a mix of those two, you're able to use a much lower heat point in the melting and can therefore actually potentially use a electric arc furnace to melt that glass. Instead of having to rely on natural gas and coal, you can use solar panels to actually make the glass. And we have a DOE grant for the mining of the silicon and the solar metals, and we're working on one right now for the glass technology. And we're feeling quite confident that that's going to come to fruition, because right now nobody is making solar glass in this country. And it means that all that glass is coming from China. There are tariffs on top of it. It has big climate impacts, and there's very strong demand for somebody to make domestic glass, particularly with recycled materials. So that's the vision of where we're heading to truly live into this circular economy strategy for solar. With that background on what we're doing, let me talk a little bit more about the big picture. Let's go to the next slide of how we imagine the solar circular economy working, and then I'll do policy, and then we can do Q&A. So this is kind of a very simplified visual of how we imagine the circular economy working. You have panel makers who currently are just taking stuff from largely Asia, digging it up, putting it in panels, they sell it to solar asset owners. And then what I'm not showing here is as soon as those things are done, they're going into landfill. That is not a circular economy. Where we're stepping in is at 6 o'clock in this diagram. Right now, we're already recycling those materials, getting out 95% of the value, and selling them back into the supply chain, but we're not yet closing the loop. The way we close the loop is by creating those sheets of glass, those aluminum panels, and potentially other products that can go directly back to the panel makers, who then are not only building panels with recycled content, but ideally they're now starting to design for recyclability on the front end, learning from what we're struggling with to take apart their existing panels. They will start making panels that are much easier to take apart. So we truly can get to this place where you are losing very little of the raw minerals and materials throughout this whole cycle. And it is totally possible to do. And we believe we're on the path to unlocking that. New York can play a critical role, which is part of why I wanted to, when Joanne invited me, I wanted to do this call. And policy is a big piece of it. So let's jump into that next. So when you're thinking about what are your options at the end of life, when you have a bunch of panels, whether you're an individual homeowner or a utility or an independent power producer, whoever you are, you got only a handful of options. One is you can landfill it. And a lot of people do. Right now, 90% of solar panels are being landfilled. You can do it in a municipal facility, although that's becoming increasingly challenging and it's risky because of the way the laws are written. Most of the bigger companies who recognize the compliance issues there are actually sending them to hazardous facilities where they're lined and can handle the the potential leaching from these panels. But bottom line is, this is where most of the panels are going today, and that's a problem. We do not want to be doing that. There are, and have been for a while now, some very low recovery recycling projects that have been happening in Europe, some here, where basically the companies come in and they remove the aluminum, they get off the copper wiring, and then basically they shred the rest and put it into road bed or turn into road beads or turn into cement. And that's better than throwing into a landfill, but it obviously misses out on all those exciting things I was talking about earlier that we're trying to do. So we're the third option here, right? Which is advanced high recovery recycling, where you're really trying to close the loop and return those minerals and materials back to the supply chain. And then, of course, where possible, you want to be able to refurbish, repair, and resell panels or reuse them yourself on site. And you also have this opportunity of doing what we call second life project development, where imagine if we're able to prove that we can power our industrial facility with second life solar panels, then we think we'll be able to sell those to other people in West Texas or other areas where land is cheap and they're doing it behind the meter, so they're not as concerned about some of the things that you'd hit if you were in New York City, for instance. So that's those are the options people currently have. If we go to the next slide, the reason why we're not seeing as much recycling and reuse as we'd like is because landfill is just quite cheap. If you want to take your panel to a municipal landfill, might cost you $1 or $2. More and more, they're not accepting it. So then if you take it to a hazardous landfill, maybe it's $6, $7, $8, but to recycle, it will cost you anywhere from $15 to $30. So that's a pretty big difference. So the two big barriers that are related is landfill is cheap and recycling is still relatively expensive. Another thing that adds to the expense of recycling and is challenging and just leads companies in many cases to just go to a hazardous landfill is that the way the federal RCRA law is written, the Resource Conservation Recovery Act is written, says that panels may or may not be hazardous. It's ultimately the owner's responsibility to figure it out. And if you get it wrong, you're liable for any of the damage done. And so what that means is if you're shipping to a recycler, you have to pay to have it, the bill and lading has to be hazardous. You have to, all the transportation has to be done that way. And then the person who receives the panels has to have a RCRA certified hazardous waste facility, the same thing you might have for truly toxic waste or pesticides, that kind of thing. And so the reason why I think so many panels are being recycled or landfilled, not recycled, is because if you're a big asset owner and you're looking at that risk of maybe getting fined, it's a much simpler choice to just wipe your hands of it and send it to a hazardous waste facility and be like, well, at least I'm not going to get sued later down the line or potentially even go to jail. There's criminal prosecutions possible if you don't handle those panels right. And so a real barrier here is that I believe the laws are written in such a way that treat panels overly cautiously in terms of how little actual hazardous waste is in them. And we can talk about that more later. The other big barrier is just panel volumes today are just really low. You hear, I'm sure many of you joined this call because you've heard oh, there's a tsunami of solar panels coming and we got to deal with it. But honestly, at this point, and I'll have a slide on it later, it's still not a significant number to justify a bunch of people building up businesses. And so there isn't really the capacity yet to do the recycling, particularly the advanced recycling we're talking about. And then finally, very importantly, there aren't really incentives out there for the manufacturers to be using recycled materials. There's no tax benefits. There's no additional benefits you get under the infrastructure law or the IRA. And so without that, it just makes it harder to encourage people. Basically, people are doing it because they know it's the right thing and they know it could be a black eye for the industry. But other than that, almost all the other currents are pushing towards the wall of landfill. So let's go to the next slide and talk about how we can solve that. And it starts by understanding, as we're thinking about policy, that solar isn't really like other e-waste or electronic devices. And the first reason is kind of obvious, but I think it's worth stating, which is, for a lot of stuff, it's like, hey, we want people to consume less, right? But with solar, we actually want people to be consuming a lot more, because without more solar, the climate crisis gets worse. So as a first filter, when we're thinking about policies on recycling, let's make sure that we don't inadvertently put in place a policy that leads to deployment of solar to really go down. And that's not a hypothetical thing. Washington State passed a law several years ago to really force companies to recycle, and they put in place a very complex and overly challenging law. And basically, the industry said, we're going to stop selling in Washington State. And so then the state delayed and delayed and delayed, and it's now like 5 years later, and the thing hasn't even gone into effect yet. But it created a whole bunch of uncertainty. So I put that out there, that we just need to be very thoughtful as we're putting in place any sort of regulatory framework for solar, that we don't accidentally, with good intention, really make it hard to build the solar we need to avoid climate chaos, or at least mitigate the chaos that's already here. So that's piece one. Piece two is, unlike a laptop or a cell phone or so much of the rest of the e-waste, these panels, once they're out there and working, and assuming they don't get hit by a storm, they're out there for 20, 35 years. And most of the existing e-waste solutions that work for these smaller things don't really work well for things that are going to be out there for that long. The other consideration is, most e-waste is owned by individuals. And so you can put in place solutions that encourage them to recycle when they take back their car batteries, or, you can put in place extended producer responsibility laws for laptops and cell phones. But with solar, most of the solar is owned by fewer than 100 companies in this country. And so thinking through, what are the business to business tools or solutions that can encourage recycling that might be different than what would move consumers is an important consideration here. And as I mentioned earlier, the volumes are still very small and also very dispersed. Like, I talked to a lot of policymakers who are like, cool, yeah, recycling, I love what you're doing. We want this here in my state. And eventually we should have recycling capacity for solar in most states, particularly the bigger solar states. But right now, even California or Texas, which are the biggest solar states, there's not enough volume to justify the scale and investment that we're putting in. Like that glass factory I talked about a minute ago that we're building, that's a $300 million investment to really be able to take all that, cull it, and turn it into new glass. And you can't be doing that in 50 states. The stuff we're doing on the solar metals, that's going to be, $25, $30 million investment. And so until you get to really large scale, you need to think about, how am I creating policies that allow for the free flow of panels across states to places that can really, do this at the level that it needs to be done, and hit the costs and the economies of scale that make sense. And then finally, the biggest difference, I think, about solar panels compared to so much else that we worry about recycling is there's just a huge amount of value in these panels. Rystad Energy did a study that said that the theoretical value in each panel could be $68. We're not seeing that, but we're seeing pretty significant value here. And, you don't need a recycling policy for like gold bars. I'm not sure we're going to need recycling policy for solar panels once we really get good at what we're doing. And so it's important not to put in place policies that are overreactive and like, oh, well, there's this challenge now, let's solve it, and put in place whole new agencies and challenging things that maybe 3 or 4 years from now we're not going to need, because basically the market's going to figure it out. So those are some big picture policy considerations. Now I'll just go through and give you a couple, if we can go to the next slide, a couple of data points just so you can see it in more detail. So what this slide shows is getting back at like the value that's in a panel and where that value is. On the left side, you can see the material composition of a panel, and like look at the glass, that's 70% of the weight of the panel, but notice it's only 2% of the value on the right side. Whereas if you look at the composition of the polysilicon on the left, it's only 5% of the weight, but it's 60% of the value, right? And the copper is only 2% of the weight, but it's 6% of the value. And so what this gets at is, as you're thinking about policy, it's very important not to put in place policies that are focused on weight recovery. And that's how most recycling is focused, is how much of the total mass of the panel or the thing am I recovering? But for solar, it's very, I mean, you want to get all of it if you can, but it's crucial that you don't accidentally put in place policies that encourage people to get the weight, but not the value. And that is how Europe and Japan and a couple of the other countries that have recycling policies, they're all driving towards very low bar, take off the frame, get off the copper, and then shred the rest and put it in a roadbed. And we really want to think about how do we encourage and support advanced recycling, then get all those materials back into the domestic supply chain. So that was one point I really wanted to make. The next one is just that, while by 2050, if you look out to the far end of the right side of this chart, whether in the early loss scenario that Irina looked at or the regular loss scenario, you're talking about 10 million tons of waste coming from solar panels, which is significant. To put that in perspective, currently the US total only has about 7 or 8 million tons of e-waste. So, by 2050, if we don't figure out how to recycle this and really get those materials back into the supply chain, solar could be equivalent to all the waste, that e-waste that's currently out there. However, today, if you go over, further to the left, it's less than 1% of the total e-waste. And we don't even hit 1 million tons until the end of this decade, which is, 10, 12% of the total. So when you hear people talk about the tsunami of panels coming, I like to think of it more as like a slowly building wave that we have time to kind of figure out. I'm a surfer a little bit, not very good, but I try. And that's how I look at this, is like, we just got to figure out, how do we get on this wave and ride it? And ultimately, we don't want to see the numbers on the right here ever happen, but we also don't want to put in place a bunch of policies or things that accidentally and inadvertently, because of the iron law of unintended consequences, make it harder to actually get all the value and raise costs and lead people to not want to recycle. And we are seeing that with some of the early countries that have put in place some of these laws. We want to learn from that. We can go to the next slide. As I mentioned, the ownership of panels is quite concentrated. Basically, less than 15% of panels in this country are owned by individuals. I think a lot of people, when they think about, solar panel recycling, they think about somebody like me who has solar on their roof to power their electric car and their heat pump. And people like me exist. Maybe many of you are people like that, but that is actually a quite small part of the overall challenge. We do want to solve it. We do need to figure out ways to allow individual homeowners who don't own solar as part of a lease through some big business to figure out how to recycle. But the biggest thing we need to address is what's happening at the commercial industrial level and then the utility scale. That's the gray bar there. And that's where the real opportunity is. And businesses know how to deal with stuff like this through decommissioning plans, through bonding, through insurance, through putting in place agreements. And I'm talking to a lot of these companies. They're doing this now. I think that there are ways to encourage and incentivize and mandate, but create flexibility on how they actually reach it. And then you put in place different kinds of solutions for the residential owners. So the big takeaway here is one size will not fit all as we're looking at policies, and we want to come up with something that works for business and the big scale stuff, and then also for residential. We've only got a couple more slides here, I think. So one of the big challenges that comes up with recycling is just that there's really a patchwork of laws, not laws, but rules in different states on how to handle solar panels. They put all the onus on the generator of the waste, so that whoever owns the panel, whether it's an individual homeowner or a big utility, and those are the people that are ultimately responsible. And yet there's not much information out there on whether a panel is or isn't hazardous. The T-clip test, which is the test you use to determine if a panel is hazardous, is quite inconsistent. We've been doing it a lot, and the same panel one time will show up as hazardous, another time won't. It's a pretty bad test, and yet that's the underlying thing you need to do. And if it fails that test, then you have to ship it as hazardous waste. It has to be handled as hazardous waste. It adds a huge amount of expense, and it's very complicated. So it's important to know that. And every state basically has a different rule, and so it just makes it really hard to manage. If you go to the next slide, I won't go through all of these, but these are the different rules that guide this is the framework for how solar panels are handled, but you can just see there's so many different things. This isn't even all of it. If you go to the next slide, you can see these are the different laws that exist for how you handle panels. And what's wild is, if you were to take a panel from Florida, which is a transfer-based exclusion state, and ship it to California, every time it passes through a different colored state, it would have to get a different kind of bill of lading and other things. So from Florida, you have to go through like Alabama, Arkansas, right through that little panhandle down through New Mexico, Arizona. It's a mess. And so one of the key things we're really working on at different state levels and at the federal level, and I think New York is actually working on this right now, is how do we create a more unified way of working within the universal waste designation or the transfer-based exemption designation, but basically harmonize these so it's easier to move panels within a state and then across states. Okay, next slide. I won't go through all of this, but these are some of the policies that different states have been pursuing. There's the universal waste designation, which is basically a subcategory of hazardous, but makes it easier to handle. These are the states that have either adopted it or failed to adopt it. I think New York is currently looking at it. There are benefits, pros and cons on universal waste. Happy to get into that later. Bunches of states are doing like a study bill, like, hey, this is complicated, let's look at it. These are the states that are doing that. 2 states have tried to put in place a landfill ban. Neither of them have gone through. Decommissioning can be a really powerful tool. New York is one of the leaders on this. If we can figure out how to ensure that as part of a decommissioning plan, recycling is required for the big companies, right? The big solar farms, that could be huge. And one of the best opportunities I see to really drive recycling. And then you have extended producer responsibility bills, which basically have traditionally been used for e-waste. They put in place agencies that manage, you pay up front. That was what was passed in Washington and has not gone into place over 5 years. Your county upstate there, Niagara, is the only place in the country currently that has one. If you go to their website, you'll see that exactly one company has signed up to do it and they're out of business. And then on the right side of the page, you'll see about 100 companies that aren't doing it yet. We have been working with the county. They've been great. Like, I really love the people there. They're trying to make it work. We are, as a company, trying to become a stewardship organization to see if it can function, but it is really challenging. I'm happy. I saw there was a question about that. I'll get into it later. But I think when you dig into it, you'll see that there are reasons why an EPR probably isn't the right solution for solar, and Niagara could be a great case study in that. If we go to the next slide, the main things we need to do, in my mind, in terms of policy, if we're really going to accelerate recycling, is let's move at the speed of the problem. Let's start off with making it easier to transport and recycle solar. So in New York, I forget which agency it is, but there's an agency that is looking at the universal waste rule and how do you tweak it, make it better so that it's easier to move solar panels out of New York, within New York and then out of New York so that they can be recycled. And I think that's great. There are other things other states can do, but like I think that's a really critical first step is let's make sure that you can actually move these panels around so that if they're destined to be recycled at a place that is permitted to do recycling at a hazardous level, that should not cost you huge amounts of extra money because you're just moving these panels that aren't, actually hazardous during a transport. Second one is, I think it is important for states and the federal government to start to require recycling, not overnight. Like I think you want to put, like in California, I'm working on a bill right now that will put recycling mandates in place starting in 2026. I think that gives the industry time to start adjusting. It sends market signals, it gets everybody working on it. But I think it's very important to require recycling, but also create flexibility because as I mentioned earlier, one size doesn't fit all. There's lots of different ways to make that work. And it's important to create that flexibility and not just be like, hey, I know it worked on cell phones and laptops. Let's just put it on solar panels. I don't think that's the way to do it. And then finally, and critically, you want carrots and sticks on stuff like this. I think it would be hugely beneficial if states and particularly the federal government were to put in place tax benefits and other benefits for manufacturers or big project owners to recycle their projects or use recycled materials rather than throwing them away. Because you could imagine, like at the end of our process, we've got a bunch of materials. Right now, we're scrambling to sell them to people who may or may not have a use for them. But if all of a sudden, all the manufacturers who are building facilities in this country got a big incentive to use recycled materials, they're going to pay more for what we're getting out, which then allows us to go back to the solar asset owner who has the broken panels or the end of life panels in the first place. And instead of charging them, between $15 and $20 a panel, maybe we can now charge $12 or $10 or $8. And that's the way this whole thing, in my view, is going to work is if we can really kickstart the flywheel of the circular economy by making it easier to move these panels, reduce the cost, send market signals that states are going to require it, create flexibility, and create incentives for people to use recycled material and design for recycling. I think what you're going to see is the same basic innovation and market pathway you saw with solar and wind, where you get 90% cost reductions. And all of a sudden, solar today is the cheapest form of energy. And it's the most widely deployed form of energy. And that was a mix of policy and market forces and innovation and scale. I think that if we can get these three things in place and don't try to do too much at once, but send some signals and see how the market develops, we can do the same thing with recycling and drop the price of recycling so that basically it is at or below the price to landfill. And at that point, you don't really need that much policy because there's so much value in the panel, nobody's going to be throwing them away. And that's the vision that I see. And I feel very confident that we can get there. And I'm excited to now hear your thoughts and what you're all wrestling with in New York. And hopefully, it looks like I spent the time I was supposed to spend. And Joanne, I'll let you take it from here. There's our vision. You've seen it. Ready to take questions, hear comments, and see your faces.
All right. So let's go first. Thank you, on that was very, very interesting. I know it's a lot of material to cover in a short amount of time, so I appreciate it. That's there's definitely a lot to involve to get this up and running. It's not a simple thing. I have one question before we get started is on the federal level, it does sound like a lot of this needs to be addressed federally to make it smoother and more consistent across the country. So what's being done on a federal level right now?
Yeah, you're right. That is key. I'm in fact going to DC in a week or so to have meetings on this exact topic. What's challenging at the federal level in terms of the harmonizing across states is that the way RCRA is written, the Resource Conservation Recovery Act, which is underlying all of this, is basically states ultimately get to decide what to do. The feds can't come in and say everybody has to do X. And so, and that's good. Like coming from Sierra Club, there were a bunch of clean air acts like that too, because you don't want states to just be like, oh, you know, I'm going to do whatever I want, because there are states that are going to do some pretty bad things. But what that means is the feds already put out this thing called the transfer-based exclusion. The EPA at the federal level said, hey, everybody, we want you to do this, because if you do it, it's going to make shipping solar so much easier. And yet only 30 states have done it. So there are a couple things, though, they can do. There's a bunch of regulatory interpretations that are available to the EPA. This Biden administration in particular has people that are interested in it. And so we're pushing on the EPA to basically, there are things you can do, like with scrap metal exemptions. There are other ways you could change the test. There's nothing in statute that says you have to use the T-clip test. We could come up with a test that's actually better, that would make it easier to figure out if panels were not toxic. So there's a handful of things like that that the EPA could do without any new statute that would allow the problem to get solved. But the bigger thing that I'm hoping to get the Biden administration to do is more around was two things. It's convening a group of stakeholders, state leaders, but also industry leaders and others to come together and really figure out, like, what is a whole of government approach to creating the circular economy for solar. They've done that for batteries and done a quite good job with it, but they haven't yet put in place something that looks at solar in the same way and the synergies between solar and batteries. So I think there's a big thing the feds can do to pull people together and basically have a task force that looks at solving these problems. And then the final one is, you know, we've already passed the IRA and the infrastructure bill, and there's a bunch of money flowing out to people to build solar plants in this new manufacturing or build new solar plants themselves. They could interpret grant money or tax incentives in such a way that if you used recycled materials or if you committed to recycling your panels, you could get additional benefits through those existing bills. And so I'm definitely pushing to see if we can get that going. Because like I said, I think you can get more done here probably through incentives than you can through the sticks of like charging, like the Niagara bill and the Washington bill. They both will charge you $100 a day per panel if you're not in their program. A normal project these days will have 1 million panels. Does it really make sense to charge a solar company $100 million a day because they're out of compliance on recycling? It doesn't make sense. And so I think the more we can do through incentives from the federal level, the better.
Great. Okay. So if people could put their questions in the Q&A, then I'll have them all in one spot, but I'll just go to the chat right now about first thing is creating solar panels that are easier to separate and reduce the hazardous components. And is there technology being in development?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that? I was reading something in the chat and yeah.
It's probably the same. Is there technology in development right now to make solar panels less hazardous with their composition and recycle the separate materials?
Yes, there is. There's a cool new voluntary program called EPEAT, which basically is a labeling program that looks at the entire build of a panel and will help companies take out some of the hazardous materials. And the main hazardous material that exists in solar panels is lead. And this EPEAT label ensures that you're lead free, or at least that you get a bunch of extra points for being lead free. And so I do think one of the things states could do that would help with this, and the feds could do it too, is require that panel makers basically disclose the build of material that goes into the panel. And if people see that, and then you can see, hey, I got my lead-free panels or panels with lead, people are going to go with the lead-free. And you could also start really, that's something that could be mandated, is start making, we make gas without lead, we could start making panels without lead. And then there's no mandatory rules on designing panels for recyclability. I don't think we necessarily want that. I think you get there with incentives and tax benefits, but we definitely want to get to a place where panel manufacturers are thinking about, how am I designing a panel to be easier to take apart and return back into the supply chain. And I can tell you, because I work with a lot of these folks, they're working on it. Like they get it, and they're not doing it. They do care about the planet. That's why they're making solar, but they also see it's a way to make more money. And so this is one of those places where you can do right by the world and also reach your bottom line and satisfy your shareholders.
Okay, great. Okay, in the chat, there's just another comment to you, so I'll leave that. Aaron has his hand up, so if we could go ahead, Aaron, can you are you able to unmute yourself? It doesn't sound like it. Let me see. Okay, well, Aaron, if why don't you put your question in the chat or in the Q&A section, and then we can address it when we get here. So next is a question about donating solar panels to MIR. Do you know what a MIR is? A solar radiation management organization, 501c3?
I'm not familiar with that particular charity, but I am familiar with the idea of donating panels. I think it's worth exploring. We've been looking at it. The challenge is, we've had conversations with a bunch of folks, both in country, like, well, I won't name names, but we have had conversations, and what we get back a lot is, we don't want you to donate your second life panels. We want the new panels. Mm-hmm. And there's an interesting reaction I wasn't expecting, where people are like, why are you people always trying to give us your second stuff? We want your new stuff. And so we've been looking at it. Ukraine's actually come up a bunch, and they do want second life solar panels. So we're trying to gather some there because they need whatever they can get. But for a lot of this stuff, like Habitat for Humanity has been a good outlet, and they seem interested in it. My guess is that more and more we'll find people that want to take it. But I just want to say, as we do our testing and we're figuring out if panels can be reused, I feel quite confident that the panels we're getting that have been out in the field could also go back out into another field, and that they'll be safe there. Would I put second life panels that have already been out and shipped around up on my roof? Don't know, and I'm not the only one who doesn't know. Like, fire marshals all over the country are not very clear on whether or not it makes, like, what are the tests you need to do to make sure that a panel isn't going to accidentally short out. And so I just think there's reasons to be cautious about assuming that panel donations is going to solve this problem. I think it'll be a piece of it, but my assessment is it'll probably only be 10, 15%, and really mostly done as a feel-good thing, as a branding thing, as a marketing thing. There may be a few really good specific solutions. I'm not familiar with the one you brought up. I definitely think it's worth pursuing because we're going to have a lot of second life panels out there. And right now there aren't that many applications that make sense. So I think it's worth pursuing. I just haven't gotten the kind of uptake that I thought I was going to get.
Mm-hmm. Good. Thank you. Let's see. I have a couple people, I think, who have raised their hands, but I can't see them. I think, again, if you just put your questions in the Q&A, then we can address them that way. So next question is from Lance Gunderson. And how many panels would a company like yours need to process to be financially solvent? In other words, where is the end game that's going to start making a profit?
Yeah, I mean, without getting too detailed, because that is a bit of a trade secret, as we say, we think that once our phase 1 fab in Odessa is doing somewhere between the 300,000 panels and 1 million panels that we're set to do this year, that unit itself will be profitable. It could be closer to 300,000. It could be closer to the million. There's a lot of things that we're still figuring out. We're still at the phase of negotiating with our off-takers on how much they'll pay for the silver and the silicon and all it depends on what happens to material sales and or commodity prices. But that's the rough answer, is that we think that once you can get a factory somewhere between let's call it 100 megawatts, or I'm sorry, 300 megawatts in a gig a year, you should be able to make a pretty decent profit and have this thing functioning. That's the vision.
Okay, so
and that doesn't, by the way, the glass, once we start getting into making aluminum frames and glass panels and sheets from it, that changes the economics quite a bit, and makes it much more profitable. But that also requires a much bigger scale. Then to really make, just to finalize that point, to make that part work, you have to be doing over a gig a year. So call that 3.5 million panels ish. Mm-hmm. And we expect that, but we don't expect that for 3 or 4 more years.
Okay. So in the long run, then, will there be enough to sustain your industry, or will other potential sources of power cause the recycling industry to become obsolete?
No, I think there definitely will be. I mean, we don't have to go back and look at that chart, but if you imagine that IRENA wave chart I was showing you, while it's not like immediately here today, it's coming pretty fast, and we will have millions of tons of solar panels, and each of those tons is worth quite a bit of money. And we're heading towards 1 billion panels in this country, and something like 4% of them a year are going to be reaching end of life. That's a lot of panels. And globally, we're going to be at 10 billion panels pretty soon. So, and again, I don't know where that's going to plateau and stabilize, but basically all of our projections, these have been, validated to some degree. It's still an emerging area, but they tend to land around about 4% of that install base is going to reach end of life each year. So 4% of 10 billion is a lot. And Rystad Energy found you get $68 per panel theoretically. We're getting a lot less than that, but this isn't going to be like we're not doing this to be the next AI whatever. This isn't some kind of unicorn company, but we do think that this is a very stable, potentially global business that, particularly once you start creating those value-added products like the glass and the aluminum, selling back to the manufacturers, you figure out how to micronize the silicon. I believe we're going to be a very, there will be multiple competitors, obviously, but I think there's a lot of reason to believe that recycling for solar is going to be very big and self-sufficient.
Okay, great. Someone was asking if they could get a copy of your PowerPoint.
I think so. I need to scrub it. I mean, I did look at it. I don't think there's anything proprietary in there. Let me just double check that. But I'll send you, Joanne, I guess I've already sent it to you. But before you send it out, let me just go through and make sure there's nothing in there that shouldn't go out. But I think if we send it as a PDF, it should be fine.
Okay. All right, great. Next question is the SCIA working on recycling?
Yeah, absolutely. And I saw somebody here mention they work with SIA. I've been in contact with Valessa at the New York office. I work with the senior folks at the national office on this. They have a very, it's a growing program. They hired somebody who came out of e-waste, who is running their efforts to authorize recyclers and support recyclers. So we are SIA approved. They came and visited our site. They did an audit. There's maybe a handful of other companies that have also been audited. They're also working on policies. So the folks in New York are pretty engaged and thinking about Niagara and thinking about what we can do at the state and kind of hopefully harmonize those things. I'm working with people in California. They're definitely on both the policy side and the business development side. And they're not alone. Several of the big trade groups are really invested in this. Advanced Energy United is doing a lot. American Clean Power, which I believe was founded by Podesta, they're doing a lot. So there are a bunch of trade groups. Everybody, I mean, basically, people see that this is necessary, right? Right now, however many gigawatts of solar we plan to be building in this country, most of them are still using raw minerals and materials that are coming from China. Everybody wants to shift that in this industry. They both for political reasons, national security reasons, climate reasons, brand reasons. And so everybody's figuring out how do we do this, particularly because once you start digging into the economics of it, you're like, oh, I mean, it's kind of a joke around like, you don't have to mandate recycling gold bars, but these panels are quite valuable. So I do think that once people start seeing this, they're like, oh, we just need to figure out how to catalyze this, seed it, and then it should just take off on its own.
Great. Okay, so next question, what is hazardous that leaches? This person consults for recycling hard to recycle materials, also with a utility company for New York City and surrounding counties.
Yeah, honestly, not much. Like NREL studied this and basically they went out and said, look, ignore the test that the EPA's put out there. And let's just take a bunch of panels and simulate what would look like if you crushed them up and threw them in an unlined landfill and just let's see what happens. And they found that even under like really bad handling and other, lots of water, unlined pits, that there was no damage to human or environmental health in their simulations. So I think it's important to recognize there really isn't very much hazardous in solar panels. And so we do need to fix that. But the answer is the main thing is the lead. Lead is obviously not great. We're recovering it and making sure it gets back into the supply chain for lead. But you don't want that you don't want to grind it up and then have a bunch of lead out there. It's not a huge amount, but it's enough. I mean, lead in even very small amounts, right? Paint, whatever, it's not good for you. There's another panel type. Mostly I've been talking about crystalline silicon. We also are soon going to be recycling cadmium telluride, the thin film panels that are made by First Solar and a few others. Those have in them cadmium telluride, which has this reputation as being hazardous, but actually it passes the T-clip test much more often than the crystalline panels. And you can handle those panels without hazardous waste permits. They recycle them without hazardous waste permits. And so I think there's a bit of a misperception out there that those panels are toxic. And it's because the telluride, I can't remember if it's cadmium or telluride. One of them, I'm not a chemist, but one of them is actually quite toxic on its own. But once you bond the cadmium and telluride together, it's basically an unbreakable bond and it's inert at that point. So I honestly think, and this is one of the things I'm talking to the Biden administration about, and I think states should get aware of, is just like, I'm not saying they're not, that they shouldn't be handled carefully. We don't want to just take a bunch of panels, grind them up and throw them in a river, clearly. But like right now, they're basically regulated the same as pesticides, and that's crazy. So how do we rationalize that more? That's one of the big things I'm working on, because I can tell you that anti-solar forces are creating all sorts of misinformation about like, oh my God, when it rains on solar panels, it basically is radioactive. It's like, and they're like space lasers creating climate change. It's just crazy misinformation, but it's out there. And so we need to be careful as we're working on trying to put these policies in place that we don't accidentally play into the hands of the anti-solar lobby, which unfortunately is growing every day.
Right. So another question, there are already companies that are reusing solar panels and they sort at the farm level. So only sending the unusable panels to recycling. So isn't that more efficient than sending all the panels across the country?
It can be. I mean, yeah, I wouldn't, if people are finding good companies that are reliable, that can that are local and reusing them locally, that's better. But I'm not I mean, I'd be interested in hearing more about that. Feel free to send me an email. But my sense is that most of the companies will go and pick them up on site, and then they ship them back to Georgia or Arizona or somewhere else and do the same thing. And then they're shipping us the recycling, because there are very few companies out there that are actually doing the advanced recycling we're doing. And so I do think, though, that that question's getting at a pretty important point, which is whatever's happening currently. And I don't think it's quite, I don't know if companies are doing it the way that that was phrased. I do think that if we can figure out a model where you can do good, effective testing locally and then redeploy those panels locally and only ship them out to a recycler when that's necessary, that is probably a good thing. But it's not as obvious as you think, because, you know, a lot of panels, they're degrading each year. Not a ton, but they lose about 0.5%. So if you're dealing with a bunch of panels that are, say, 12, 15 years old, and say you're in New York and you're a grid constrained area and the price per kilowatt hour is really high, it isn't going to make any sense in any rational world to reuse. Say you're taking a bunch of panels off of an IKEA outside of Manhattan, you know, Westchester County. There is no world in which it's going to make sense to take those panels off in Westchester County and put them in down the street in Westchester County, even if you put them up on people's roofs, because each square meter of power generation for solar is very valuable out in a place like that. And what our analysis suggests is actually it may make more sense to move those panels out to a place where land is very cheap and where you can use them in applications that really make sense for older, kind of less efficient panels. And then eventually you need to ship them to be recycled, right? Those ones you were just talking about, even if you use them in Westchester, 5 years from now, they got to get shipped out to Odessa or wherever you're doing it. So maybe it makes sense to only do that handling and shipping and packaging once, do it close, and do it in a place where the conditions make more sense to use outdated and inefficient panels. Because it's not just that the panels are losing a little bit of capacity each year, it's that new panels are significantly more efficient. So, you know, right now on my home, I've got like 12 or 13-year-old panels, and I think they're 220 watt panels. I can now get like 500 or 600 watt panels, and my roof's full. Well, when I bought my solar, I didn't have an electric car, and I didn't have a heat pump, and I'm now like, don't have enough. So even in my own house, it now probably makes sense to put in new panels, but it's not going to make sense for anyone else to buy those panels nearby here in Oakland. I need to move them out somewhere where the land is cheaper, and you're probably putting it out on a pretty simple racking solution with a microinverter. Anyway, that's a longer conversation, but this is not as, because I had that same thought when I first got into this, and the more I'm learning about it and the more we're looking at the economics of it, the more it looks like scale and centralization, both for the recycling and for how you're doing the reuse, is probably the way this is going to play out. But we'll see.
So how powerful is the second generation or the reused panels versus the first? And how many generations do you suspect can the panels be recycled before they are put in a landfill?
Oh, well, I'm not sure I fully understand the question. Is the question, I got a panel that
the materials in the panel. So you're reusing or recycling them. I think that's what the question was.
Okay. Well, so the first thing we want to do is when we get a panel, you try to reuse it. Our view is you can reuse that for probably another 5 to 10 years. It totally depends, right? You might get a panel that's only 5 years old, maybe get 10 more years out of it. If the panel is 10 years old, maybe get 5 more years out of it, but you don't get to keep reusing it. It probably only has a first life in an application that makes sense where it's originally installed, and then it maybe has one more life, the panel, before you recycle it. Once you recycle it, then you're getting back at the raw minerals and materials, and those can be, I mean, aluminum can basically be recycled infinitely. You lose just a teeny bit each time. Infinite obviously isn't right, but hundreds of times, right, before you're done. Silicon, getting back to metallurgical silicon, you can recycle that over and over. Silicon, we're getting like 99% of it. So, you know, like I said, our CTO believes, we don't have a paper on it yet that's been peer reviewed, but he's pretty confident that if you take an old panel that was made 20 years ago and you break it down to its core components today, you could make a brand new panel with what you recover, even though you've got some loss, because new panels are so much more efficient. You can actually make a new panel with one old panel. So is that true? Have we proven it yet? No, but theoretically, that is what we're heading towards, particularly around the precious metals and the aluminum and the glass.
Okay. All right, two questions that are related as far as whether China is working on this and how China and the Chinese policies regarding manufacturing affect the future of solar recycling.
They're absolutely working on it and investing a lot. They see the same thing we're seeing. And obviously most of, well, I don't know if it's obvious, but most of the panels in the United States are coming from China today, right? And not the first solar ones, but that's about 5% of the overall panels. The rest almost all come from China or from Chinese companies that are based in Southeast Asia. So they see the same things we see. They're investing heavily in designing for recyclability and for the same kind of stuff we're doing. They're doing it either as manufacturers or as part of the ecosystem, like we are, not connected to manufacturers, but part of the overall supply chain. And we have a R&D team based in China, learning from what they're doing, but also doing things somewhat different because we have different, whatever, we're doing it differently. But we are learning from them. I think they will end up in the same way. They're making more panels than everybody else. I suspect they will be recycling more than anybody else. And while we expect to be a global company, we don't plan to compete directly with China. So we're going to be focused on North America, South America, potentially some of the India has a lot of promise, but China is going to really dominate, certainly China itself and wherever they're selling panels. And so we want to support that, right? Much better for them to be using recycled materials in their very large manufacturing chain than digging it up in Sichuan province or whatever over and over again. So we support that, but ultimately, I think the way Janet Yellen talks about is we're diversifying our supply chain. We're not decoupling, we're diversifying. And I think we want the United States to be able to supply our own raw minerals and materials to make panels. We should still buy some panels from China. I'm not saying like never, but the more we can do it ourselves and the more we can create jobs here, not just installation jobs and development jobs, but also manufacturing jobs and mining and refining jobs from the recycling. It's just a better way to go. And it's better for the climate. It's better for the economy. And so that's our vision, is to really ultimately be able to compete with China, both on recycling and on the manufacturing.
Great. So another question is about how you can prevent negative concepts about solar panels and solar, such as, related to mining and containing lead and leakage and things,
Yeah.
Yeah. So we know that the impact's negligible compared to fossil fuels that people don't talk about, but what has been your experience, and how do you share share the actual facts with people?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's actually what brought me into this in the first place. Is I mentioned the story about the deep sea mining, but the other part of my origin story with this was at the Sierra Club. I was working on replacing coal plants and gas plants with solar. And then all of a sudden our own activists were like, but wait, what about the mining and the toxic runoff and all this stuff? I was like, oh my God. And I started digging into it. And I realized there was just these Facebook groups that are funded by like Trump EPA people who are creating all this misinformation, and it's everywhere. We're just a little small company. We can't do much. What we're doing is helping the bigger companies have a good answer to this question, providing them with the data, helping them put out press releases, helping them educate elected officials. We don't have white papers ourselves, but folks, I think SIA has some. I know American Clean Power has some, but I think it would be really useful for maybe a group like yours. I don't quite know where you draw the line, but certainly you can do public education. So putting together, some kind of white paper, or nobody reads white papers, so let's not do a white paper, something that would help people just understand that, like, actually solar panels are not hazardous at the level people think, and that there is a way to recycle, and we can build them here in this country, and that's increasingly happening. Somebody needs to figure that out. I'd like to help it. I can provide data. I've been trying to get like the University of Texas to partner with NREL to put forward some kind of study. I think op-eds can be useful, but so much of this stuff's happening on social media and Facebook. We just need individual citizens. That's why one of the reasons I thought this was, this United Solar Energy Supporters seems like a good group to talk to is, you guys are real people. So get out there in your community and talk to your community members, write letters to the editor, show up at hearings when this is coming up, and counter the misinformation. I personally have canceled my Facebook stuff, but if you still use Facebook, figure out a way to provide counter information of what's out there. But somebody needs to figure this out. And it's been keeping me up at night because I think we are losing the information battle right now. And it's bad because, people are trying to be like, well, it's the whataboutism. Well, hey, why not just build more coal plants? Because basically China, you're like, why not have more gas plants and fracking? Because lead. You're like, what? These aren't even barely comparable, but there's just not enough resources going into amplifying that story. If anybody has ideas, I'm happy to help, but I'm trying now, that's what I was doing at Sierra Club. Now I'm focused on trying to get this company going, but we've got stories to tell, and if you look at our website or you track us on LinkedIn, you'll see we're helping amplify companies that are doing the right thing and telling the story. And we are going out when we see misinformation, we're trying to counter it, but it's a lot, unfortunately.
Yeah. And like you said, that's what USIS is doing is,
That's great.
Working with people out there. So one of the questions, well, there are actually two questions about lead. One was whether lead is still an issue with modern panels, where they thought that there was lead-free solder that was being used more and more. And then the other question then is there a way to get panels without lead? So they're basically the same.
Yeah, the answer is yes to both of those, that manufacturers are making panels with less and less lead, and you can get panels that are lead free, and there's increasing requirements to disclose what's in your panel, and there are voluntary labeling requirements and that stuff. And so, yeah, it is coming. And yet most of what's installed out there currently does have lead. There are also some other very trace amounts of heavy metals, like antimony is put on the glass to harden it so it's less likely to break with hail or whatever. Very small amounts, but still there are, lead is the main one, but there are a few others. But it is really, having looked at like coal ash, for example, and what's in that, it's like apples, not even apples and oranges, it's like apples and elephants. It's just totally different things. But there's always going to be, just like in your laptop, where there's always going to be a little bit of material that you don't want just throwing out into the wild, but you don't need to treat it like pesticide either. Right.
Okay. And the other question, would the bifacial panels be more recyclable?
Yes, in theory, for sure. Because you're getting rid of the back sheet, which is kind of unrecyclable, and glass is very recyclable. I say in theory because it's a little bit harder for our process to remove 2 big sheets of glass, but you can do it. And increasingly, most panels at the utility scale are now being built bifacial, just because it's more efficient. And so I think we're heading towards that world, and we're going to keep pushing for it. One other thing I should have mentioned in terms of slightly hazardous materials that would get solved, by the way, if you got rid of back sheets, is PFAS. Some of these plastics do have PFAS, and that is another reason not to just throw these away willy-nilly, but make sure you're handling the whole thing well, and then also dealing with the plastics in a responsible way. But increasingly, what we want is not to use back sheets, and then you want to have the PFAS. And to be like, I know everybody's worried about PFAS, very small amounts, but small amounts of a forever chemical is still more than you want.
Right. Okay, Peter, it looks like you have your hand up. Would you like to unmute and go ahead and talk?
Can you hear me, Joanne?
We can hear you. Thanks.
I'm sorry, but I have my lower hand I thought the lower hand is my hand down
Yes,
or,
it's down now.
okay, so I'm sorry, I don't, the presentation is very interesting. I do not have, like Jesse, I have 12-year-old panels on my house. And, I've actually thought of upgrading them. So this is very impressive and helpful. Yeah, I mean, the one comment I guess I would share is, having attended a solar meeting, a town board meeting last night, where, unfortunately, the town board voted down the solar farm. It's very frustrating. That's all I could say. There's not in my backyard, misinformation, etc. And yeah, that's all. That's off topic in terms of recycling. So thank you, Jesse.
Yeah, thanks for that comment. I will say, like, you all are a perfect organization to kind of lead on this, since you're already showing up to public hearings. I think there is clearly a space for groups like USIS, potentially SIA, Sierra Club, others to just like, we did such a good job, I think, as a community, and in this case, I'm using broad communities, environmentalists who are pushing for clean energy, to stop the construction of new coal plants and try to retire some of the dirty energy, like, in my opinion, nuclear, but certainly some of the gas plants. But where we've not really succeeded is, I feel like the fossil fuel industry basically took a page out of our book and like, oh, turns out if you show up at public hearings and you raise a bunch of fuss, people will like not approve a project. And we're now seeing, I'm sure you guys see this all the time. And yet I don't think the solar industry has really come together and help fund groups like yours or groups like Sierra Club or others to really show up and have as much of a presence as we had stopping a new coal plant. We need that same kind of energy, city by city, project by project, almost be like, no, we should build this, and this is misinformation. And I've been pushing, I've spent 20 years at Sierra Club, I've been pushing them to try to engage there. They're doing a decent job, but I feel like there could be a lot more. So if any of you are members of groups like Sierra Club, NRDC, obviously your own group, the more you can do to push those groups with big budgets to focus on this like yes part of the equation, I think that's a key way to do that. I mean, you guys are amazing, and I think you want some of these even bigger groups to join you and put some of their resources, and that's where some of the marketing and the materials can come from too.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I think, and it's really great to see a very great number of municipal employees are here tonight, board members, zoning board members, code enforcement. So there is absolutely a high demand for towns to really know what's going on and how, what's true and what really is not necessarily as true as they may have thought. So it's having someone like you here is really, I think, helpful for especially small towns that may not really have all the information or be comfortable with the information they have. So thank you. I have another question or a comment here. This person's county is host to a number of solar facilities, and they're going to have end of life panels sooner rather than later. So they're also signing the decommissioning agreements now. Do you have an example local law or regulation that handles disposal and recycling effectively? And should our local laws address use inspection handling of second life versus new panels? I think she means doing the inspections here before they get recycled. I believe that's what she's getting at.
I don't have a great model bill yet. I'd be interested in what the SIA person on the call would have to say on this, but my sense is this is probably something better. You were asking earlier, Joanne, like, can the feds just do this and deal with the patchwork? That would be helpful at a state level. And similarly, it would be better if states, like you've got ORES, New York's got some pretty powerful entities that already exist. I think the more that these kinds of things can be handled at the state level through the existing decommissioning, I think counties can play a role in pushing for that. The thing I worry about is we don't have a patchwork of every different county having different rules. that's my opinion. I don't know the exact situation that you're facing in your county, but I do think that it's much easier on the front end as people are going and building new projects as part of some sort of new state rule to require that as part of the decommissioning bond, they also have to include recycling. And I think that what you do with existing projects that are out there, I think that what I'd recommend is, hey, connect them with us and we'll come in and give them a pretty good deal. And they can get bids from other people too, obviously. But I think it's getting to the place where a lot of these companies, particularly if they're bigger companies that have a brand to worry about, or they're developers that want to develop another project, they don't want to upset the county that they're going to have to build the next project with. This is kind of de minimis, right? Like if you're talking about, oh, I'm going to spend $15 on a panel to recycle, right now it's these are $100 million plus projects. It ends up being a very small amount. So my experience is a lot of these companies are going to be willing to do it voluntarily if the county's supporting it and giving them the resource, say, here's some people to talk to. So I'd start with that and see. And if you're having a developer that's a real jerk or, is recalcitrant, maybe you threaten some kind of regulation and that'll usually get them to do something voluntarily. But, I don't have, I wouldn't go out and start putting in place a bunch of county regs on this myself. Joanne, I think you're muted.
Yeah, Shelby, you had your hand up, so go ahead and unmute yourself.
Hi, this is Shelby from Nicaea. Sorry, I had accidentally hit volume off, so I didn't hear you introduce me, but I got the notification to unmute. So about with municipalities, NYSERDA does have materials online with their clean energy siting resources page that can help municipalities with concerns. And in conversations that we have had with them, the siting team said that they will personally sit down with towns and help navigate permitting and zoning issues if they reach out. And the industry really wants to be good neighbors with towns, and a lot of those resources exist. It's just, I think there's been a gap in knowing that they do. But yeah, I just wanted to share that.
Great. Thanks, Shelby. There's a lot of information out there. I think people just don't know how to access it or where to start. So that's the job that we all have, I think, is to, make sure that people know we're around to help support them. So just a couple of things. One person said that she thinks teaching our children how to make solar panels will help future generations. So they're also asking a solar farm coming to our town to post at the school the amount of energy being produced so that people can realize, what the good is happening in their own town. So
yeah, it's smart. People love kids and education's great. And it's a good way to counter misinformation, right? With good stories and kids are learning, and totally support that.
Okay, great.
I don't know about making a solar panel. That's a little more complicated, but you can make a solar oven. That was how I first got started. That's relative. Yeah.
Oh, is it? Yeah. I saw those little kits. I was like, wow, that's easy. I was actually at a program. It was called the Summer Solar Solstice Social. It was an ice cream solstice on the summer solstice. And they had a solar oven and they were making s'mores. And so all the kids were really excited about those s'mores. So it's really cool to see what you can do. And that's a real direct link to seeing and visualizing what solar can really do. So, okay. Are there any other questions? Okay, I don't see anybody else with questions. So I want to thank you very, very much, Jesse. I think this was a great presentation. I know we'll be keeping in touch and, continuing to work together to get where we need to go. And, thank you again, everyone. Thank you for participating.
Yeah, and thank you all for participating, because you're where the rubber meets the road on this stuff. That whether you're at a city or a county or just a volunteer showing up as a concerned community member when I see solar, this is how we're gonna make this shift. So part of the reason I wanted to do this, and I got a lot of things to do, but I was like, when I heard about this, I was like, yes, I want to support you all and give you whatever information I can. But I'm also really grateful, because without you out there doing it, I think we're gonna run into a real challenge getting all the solar we need. So thank you for supporting solar.
Well, thank you, Jesse, for supporting us as well. Thank you again, everyone. I have one more question, it looked like. Oh, just thank you for the presentation. So that's great. Okay, thanks again, everybody, and have a wonderful night.
Thanks.